Picture this. You're on your hands and knees, crawling through a pitch-black sewer carved deep beneath Nottingham Castle. It's October 19th, 1330. The air is thick with mud and rot. Every scrape of your boot against stone sounds like thunder in your ears. You are not leading a royal procession. You are leading a hit squad. You're 17 years old. You're King Edward III of England. And tonight, you are a fugitive inside your own fortress. Your mission sounds like madness. Sneak into your mother's bedchamber, cut down her guards, and drag her lover, the most powerful man in England, out in chains. One wrong move, one shout in the dark, and you won't just fail. You'll be executed for treason against your own crown. This is the night childhood ends. This is the night a boy becomes something far more dangerous. How did the King of England end up crawling through filth to steal back his own throne? Before we dive into this story of survival, betrayal, and brutal power, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's wild to think that we're exploring these medieval power struggles together from all corners of the world. Now, back to the tunnel. The man Edward is hunting is Roger Mortimer. For 3 years, Mortimer had England in a chokehold. A Welsh lord with sharp instincts and zero mercy, he wasn't just the Queen's ally. He was her lover. Together, Mortimer and Queen Isabella had invaded England, overthrown Edward's father, Edward II, and, if the rumors from Berkeley Castle are true, murdered him in one of the most horrifying ways imaginable. They crowned young Edward king. But Mortimer pulled the strings. He seized land from rivals. He humiliated ancient noble families. And when Edward's own uncle, the Earl of Kent, tried to challenge him, Mortimer tricked him into a trap and had him beheaded, while the teenage king watched, powerless to intervene. Mortimer wasn't a regent. He was a parasite feeding on the monarchy, and he believed the boy king was too weak, too frightened, too controlled to fight back. He was wrong. Edward assembled a hand-picked group of loyalists, about 24 men. This wasn't an army, it was a suicide squad. They had no banners, no trumpets, no second chances. What they did have was intelligence. Sir William Eland, the castle's governor, revealed a secret, a hidden passage cut into the sandstone beneath the castle, a sally port meant for escape in times of siege. Tonight, it would be used for invasion. They moved fast, up a winding staircase carved into bedrock, past locked gates, past sleeping guards who had no idea the king himself was climbing toward them in the dark. They burst into a pantry, swords drawn. Silence shattered. They rushed the corridor leading to the Queen's chamber. Mortimer's knights blocked the doorway. Steel clashed in a tight, savage fight. It was quick. It was ugly. The guards fell. Edward's men kicked the doors off their hinges. Inside, chaos. Mortimer scrambled for his weapon. Queen Isabella threw herself between her son and her lover. She screamed words that would echo through history. "Fair son, have pity on the gentle Mortimer." But Edward wasn't looking for pity. He wanted his kingdom. They dragged Mortimer out, leaving the Queen collapsed on the floor, wailing. The coup lasted minutes. The psychological shift was permanent. Edward hadn't just arrested a traitor. He had severed the bond that had kept him captive, his own mother's influence. The aftermath was ruthless. Mortimer was hauled to London. No trial, no mercy. The peers of the realm condemned him to a traitor's death. He was hanged at Tyburn and left to rot for 2 days as a warning. The puppet strings had been cut. The lion was awake. Isabella was stripped of her lands and sent into comfortable exile at Castle Rising, alive, but politically finished. At 18, Edward stood alone at the top, but what he inherited was a mess. The treasury was empty. The Scots were raiding the northern borders with impunity. The nobility was fractured and suspicious, watching this teenager carefully. Was he another weak Edward, or something else entirely? The name Edward carried baggage. His father had been a disaster, lost wars, lost respect, lost authority. Bannockburn had become a national humiliation. The old king had elevated low-born favorites and alienated powerful barons. The shadow of Edward II hung over the court like fog. Every time the young king opened his mouth, the earls studied him. Was he weak like his father? Was he treacherous like his mother? Edward faced a brutal paradox. To rule legitimately, he had to honor his father's memory and punish those who killed him. To rule effectively, he had to be nothing like him. So he began by rewriting the story. He staged a magnificent reburial for his father at Gloucester Cathedral. An alabaster tomb, grand ceremony. He transformed a failed king into a martyred victim of treason. It was political genius. But marble monuments don't win loyalty. The English nobility was a warrior aristocracy. They respected strength. They spoke the language of chivalry. So Edward changed the tone of his entire court. The gloom of Mortimer's regime vanished. In its place, color, noise, spectacle. He opened the treasury, what little was left, to fund grand tournaments. These weren't just games. They were propaganda engines. Picture Cheapside or Smithfield packed with thousands of spectators. The smell of roasted meat and horse sweat. Banners snapping in the wind. The lions of England everywhere. Knights who had once plotted against the crown now rode beneath the king's gaze, competing for his favor. And Edward didn't sit safely on a throne. He rode into the lists himself, sometimes disguised as a simple knight, sometimes as a legendary figure like Sir Lancelot. He shattered lances against his own earls. He took hits. He bled. This was leadership you could see. The barons watched a king who could take a blow and stay mounted. A man who understood armor, balance, violence. He earned something gold couldn't buy. Respect. The era of courtly weakness was over. The Plantagenet wolf had returned. At the same time, Edward secured the succession. His wife, Philippa of Hainaut, proved everything he needed: intelligent, steady, and politically sharp. In June 1330, she gave birth to a son, Edward of Woodstock, the future Black Prince. An heir so early in the reign stabilized everything. This wasn't a temporary regime. This was a dynasty. But beneath the pageantry, a wound festered: the North. During Edward's minority, Mortimer had signed what many called the shameful Peace of Northampton. It recognized Robert the Bruce as King of Scotland and gave up English claims of overlordship. For English barons who had lost lands in Scotland, it was unforgivable. For Edward, it was personal humiliation. The Scots raided border villages, burned farms, stole livestock. The treaty bore Edward's own seal, forced upon him when he was still a puppet. He looked at that parchment and decided it wasn't worth the ink. Then fate handed him an opportunity. In 1329, Robert the Bruce died. His heir was a 5-year-old boy, David II. Scotland now had a child king. Edward saw the symmetry. He quietly backed a group known as the Disinherited, nobles who had lost Scottish lands and wanted them back. He didn't declare war outright. That would break the treaty. Instead, he let them launch a private invasion. When this ragtag force scored a shocking victory at Duplin Moor, Edward realized something. The time for shadows was over. He moved the royal court north to York. The tournament stopped. The real lances were sharpened. The assassin was about to become a general. By the summer of 1333, diplomacy was dead. Edward marched north and laid siege to Berwick-upon-Tweed, the most important border town in Britain. He wasn't testing the waters anymore. He wanted a confrontation. The Scots gave him one. Sir Archibald Douglas, guardian of the realm, assembled a massive relief army. They outnumbered the English heavily. On paper, this should have been a straightforward Scottish victory. But Edward didn't panic. He didn't charge. He stopped. He positioned his army on the slopes of Halidon Hill, overlooking a wide, boggy marsh. It was miserable ground, mud, reeds, and sucking earth. Perfect. Then he did something that shocked everyone. He ordered his knights to dismount. In the 14th century, a knight without a horse was almost an insult to his status. Cavalry charges were the heartbeat of feudal warfare. Glory came on horseback. Edward stepped off his own horse first. Message sent: we fight together, or we die together. He arranged his army in 3 solid blocks of men-at-arms, but the true innovation was on the flanks. There he placed wings of archers in a jagged harrow formation, triangular projections angled toward the enemy. These weren't farmers with bows. These were professionals wielding the English warbow. A warbow wasn't just a stick and string. It was a 6-foot length of yew wood with a draw weight that could exceed 150 pounds. You didn't learn it as an adult. You trained from childhood. It warped your skeleton. It thickened your bones. And the arrows, bodkin points, were designed to punch, not slice. At close range, they could drive through mail and even plate like a nail through thin metal. Douglas looked at the hill. He saw fewer men, knights on foot. He saw weakness. He ordered the charge. To reach the English line, the Scots had to descend their own hill and cross the marsh below. As they hit the mud, their momentum died. Thousands of men wading knee-deep, shields pressed together, formation tightening into a dense mass. Then the sky went dark. The English archers loosed. Thousands of arrows filled the air with a hissing roar. It wasn't just deadly, it was mechanical, relentless, rhythmic. The Scots weren't charging into a battle. They were walking into a machine. Arrows shattered shields, punched through helmets, pinned men together. The famous Scottish schiltron, those bristling spear formations, collapsed into chaos. Those who survived the storm clawed their way up the hill, exhausted and bleeding, only to meet a fresh wall of English men-at-arms. It wasn't a contest. It was slaughter. Douglas was killed. 5 earls died. The Scottish nobility was shredded in the mud of Halidon Hill. English losses? Maybe 20. Edward had found the formula: terrain, dismounted knights, massed archery, the tactical trinity. But as he surveyed the carnage, something shifted in his mind. This war machine was too effective, too refined, to be wasted on border disputes. Across the Channel lay France, rich, vast, powerful, and increasingly hostile. The French king, Philip VI, had been supporting Scotland, funding resistance, undermining Edward's authority. Edward looked at his longbowmen cleaning blood from their arrows and realized something dangerous. He could do the impossible. He wouldn't just defend England, he would claim France. When the French king, Charles IV, died without a male heir, the succession became a legal battlefield. Edward had a claim through his mother, Isabella, sister of the dead king. But the French nobility invoked Salic law, an old code that blocked inheritance through the female line. They handed the crown to Philip VI instead. At first, Edward stayed quiet. His own throne had only recently stabilized. Then Philip made a mistake. He treated Edward like a vassal. He confiscated the Duchy of Aquitaine, England's last continental stronghold and a massive economic asset. He threatened the wool trade with Flanders, the engine of England's wealth. Philip was squeezing England's throat. Edward punched back. He declared himself King of France. He quartered his coat of arms, golden lilies of France alongside the lions of England. It wasn't subtle diplomacy, it was total war. He mortgaged crown jewels, borrowed vast sums from Italian bankers, assembled fleets and armies. And in 1340, he sailed. Off the coast near Sluys, Edward's fleet encountered a French armada of over 200 ships chained together across the estuary, like a floating fortress. His advisors urged caution. Edward replied, "I shall cross, and those who are afraid may stay at home." He waited for wind and tide to favor him, positioned the sun behind his archers so it would blind the enemy. Then he attacked. Sluys wasn't elegant naval warfare. It was a street brawl on rocking decks. English ships grappled French vessels with iron hooks. Planks slammed down. Archers fired from elevated castles on deck, their arrows raining into tightly packed French crews. The French crossbowmen, slower and outranged, were overwhelmed instantly. Then came the boarding. Axes, swords, screams. If you fell overboard in 40 pounds of armor, you drowned. The water turned red. By sunset, the French navy was destroyed. Nearly 19,000 French sailors and soldiers were dead. England controlled the channel, but victory had a cost. Edward returned home burdened by debt. Glory didn't pay bankers. He raged, sacked ministers, demanded more taxes. He realized something critical. Naval dominance wasn't enough. To break France, he had to force Philip into open battle. He needed another Halidon Hill. He found it at Crecy. In 1346, Edward launched a chevauchée, a campaign of calculated devastation, through Normandy. Villages burned, crops destroyed, monasteries looted. It wasn't random cruelty, it was economic warfare. Every burning barn asked the French king, "Where are you?" Philip answered. He raised a colossal army, perhaps 3 times Edward's size, and pursued him across the Somme. By August 26th, Edward was cornered near a village called Crécy and Poitiers. Low supplies, exhausted men, enemy closing fast. So he chose his ground. A gentle slope, defensive pits dug, dismounted knights again, longbowmen on the flanks in their deadly formations. And then, something extraordinary. He gave command of the vanguard to his 16-year-old son, the Black Prince. The French arrived late in the day, disorganized, overconfident. Philip wanted to wait until morning. His nobles ignored him. They saw a smaller English army and wanted glory. Then a thunderstorm exploded over the field. The French Genoese crossbowmen marched forward. Their bowstrings, made of sinew, sagged in the rain. The English archers had simply removed their strings and kept them dry under helmets. When the rain stopped and the sun broke through, directly into French eyes, the Genoese fired a weak volley. Edward gave the signal. The English unleashed a blizzard. Arrows fell like snow. The Genoese broke. French knights, furious at the retreat, rode them down, trampling their own allies in blind rage. Then they charged uphill, into hell. Horses screamed under arrow fire. Knights fell. Bodies piled so high they formed barriers. In the chaos, the Black Prince's line wavered. A messenger rushed to Edward, who was watching from a windmill. "Is my son dead?" the king asked. "No, sire." "Then let the boy win his spurs." It was a ruthless gamble. The prince held. By nightfall, the French army was shattered. Thousands of nobles lay dead. The blind king of Bohemia was found the next day, still tied to his knights, slain in the charge. Crecy wasn't just a victory. It was the death of traditional chivalry, and Edward wasn't done. He marched north to Calais. He didn't want another battle. He wanted a door into France, and he was willing to starve a city to get it. After the bloodbath at Crecy, the war slowed into something colder. Edward marched to the coastal fortress of Calais. He didn't want another glorious clash of armies. He wanted something more strategic, a permanent foothold in France. Calais was perfect. A port city facing England, a gateway for wool, trade, and future invasions. There was just one problem. It was nearly impossible to take. Calais sat surrounded by marshland and double walls, its moats fed by the sea. You couldn't storm it without catastrophic losses. So Edward chose a different weapon: starvation. Instead of launching reckless assaults, he ordered his men to dig in, and not just a temporary camp. Edward built an entire wooden town outside the city walls, complete with streets, a marketplace, even administrative buildings. He named it Villeneuve-la-Hardie, Newtown the Bold. It was psychological warfare in timber form, a message to the defenders. I am not leaving. Inside Calais, food ran out. The governor, Jean de Vienne, made a grim decision. To preserve supplies for his soldiers, he expelled the useless mouths, the elderly, the sick, women and children, forcing them out between the walls and the English lines. They begged for mercy, and according to the darkest accounts, Edward refused them entry. Hundreds starved in that strip of land, visible to both sides. The romantic image of medieval warfare dissolves here. No shining armor, no noble mercy, just endurance and hunger. After 11 months, Philip of France marched an army within sight of the siege. He studied Edward's fortified position. He saw the English fleet blocking the harbor, and he turned around. Calais was abandoned. When the city surrendered, Edward initially demanded total destruction. His advisors warned him. Too much cruelty would inspire future cities to fight to the death. So Edward staged something chilling. He announced he would spare the city if 6 of its wealthiest citizens walked out barefoot, wearing only their shirts, ropes around their necks, carrying the keys to Calais. 6 men volunteered. They walked slowly through the English lines, emaciated, humiliated, prepared to die. Edward ordered the executioner forward. Then Queen Philippa, heavily pregnant, fell to her knees. She pleaded for mercy, invoking faith and love. The moment hung in the air. Finally, Edward relented. The ropes were cut. The men were spared. Was it genuine mercy or calculated theater, allowing the king to be fearsome and the queen compassionate? Either way, Calais became English. It would remain so for 2 centuries. By 1348, Edward stood at the height of his power. Victorious in Scotland, dominant in France, founder of the Order of the Garter, an elite brotherhood binding his greatest knights directly to him. He had turned ambition into empire. Then the ships arrived. They docked in southern ports carrying no soldiers, no banners, just 6 sailors and rats. The Black Death swept into England like a silent conqueror. Buboes swelling in armpits and groins. Fever, delirium, death within days. It didn't care about titles. Half the population of England would be gone by 1350. Edward, the unstoppable warlord, was powerless. His beloved daughter Joan died before reaching Spain for a diplomatic marriage. In a rare surviving letter, Edward wrote with naked grief. The man who had watched thousands die in battle broke over the loss of one child. Villages emptied, fields went untended, churchyards overflowed. But something unexpected happened. With so many dead, labor became scarce, and scarcity changes power. For the first time, peasants could demand higher wages. Lords desperate for workers paid them. Standards of living rose. Edward and Parliament saw danger. They passed the Ordinance and Statute of Laborers, freezing wages at pre-plague levels. It became illegal to demand higher pay, illegal to refuse work. Even clothing and food were regulated. It was an attempt to command economics by decree. It failed. You can't outlaw supply and demand. Wages rose anyway, quietly, unofficially, but resentment festered. The seeds of the peasants' revolt were planted in these years, and still, the war resumed. Now it was the Black Prince leading. In 1356, he launched another devastating chevauchée through France. But on his return, loaded with loot, he was trapped near Poitiers by King John II of France. Outnumbered, cut off. The prince offered to return everything in exchange for safe passage. King John refused. On September 19, 1356, the English took defensive positions among hedges and vineyards. The French, trying to avoid another Crecy, dismounted their knights and marched uphill on foot. It was logical. It was also exhausting. Climbing in heavy armor under the sun drained them. English archers targeted weak points, legs, visors. The formation slowed, compressed. Then the Black Prince counterattacked. Cavalry slammed into the tired French lines. A flanking force struck their rear. The French broke, except their king. John II fought bravely alongside his young son Philip until he was overwhelmed and captured. The Black Prince paraded him through London with theatrical humility, placing the captive king on a magnificent horse while he himself rode a simple one. It looked gracious. It was dominance. In 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny granted England sovereignty over vast French territories. Edward renounced his formal claim to the French throne in exchange for land and an enormous ransom. It was the peak, and peaks are dangerous. Queen Philippa died in 1369. Her steadying influence vanished. Edward aged rapidly, his health declined. Into that vacuum stepped Alice Perrers, young, ambitious, unapologetically greedy. She became gatekeeper to the king. Bribes flowed. Judges were intimidated. The court decayed. Meanwhile, France adapted. King Charles V avoided open battle, slowly reclaiming territory through patience and attrition. The empire shrank. In 1376, Parliament rebelled against corruption in what became known as the Good Parliament. Ministers were impeached. Alice was banished, temporarily, and then tragedy struck again. The Black Prince died in 1376 at just 45. Edward was shattered. He had outlived his queen, his heir, his glory. In June 1377, the once mighty king lay dying. Courtiers abandoned him to secure favor with his 10-year-old grandson, Richard. Legend says Alice Perrers slipped rings from his fingers as he struggled for breath. Whether true or not, the symbolism is brutal. Edward III, the conqueror of France, the architect of English dominance, died in a stripped room, attended only by a friar. Yet his legacy outlived him. He strengthened Parliament by constantly needing taxes. He elevated English over French in courts and government. He forged a national identity defined not by subservience to France, but rivalry with it. He was ruthless. He starved cities, burned countryside, crushed enemies without mercy. He was not a saint. He was a warlord. But he transformed England from a fractured, humiliated kingdom into a European superpower. And in doing so, he set the stage for everything that followed. The rise of the House of Lancaster and York, the Wars of the Roses, the shaping of modern England itself. Edward III didn't just reclaim a throne in a midnight raid. He forged a nation in fire. If you've stayed with me from the sewers of Nottingham to the battlefields of France, thank you. And if you want to explore what happened next, how Edward's own bloodline tore itself apart in civil war, make sure you're subscribed, because the story only gets darker from here.